I think you're not the first one that says that they had to ask their colleagues about the movie and the song as well to make sure you got it right. But I hope
Which
it was,
also tells you what's the participatory culture of European
yeah,
think tanks.
yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Anyway, so I'm gonna start in a second. Everybody comfortable? Welcome to OTT Talks, a series of conversations with think tankers, policymakers, and experts around the world. This episode is part of a series of discussions with European think tank leaders to reflect on the nature of their work in a rapidly changing continent. My name is Enrique Mendizabal, and I am co-hosting this session with Goran Buldioski. Today, we have the honor of having Simonida Kacarska with us. But first, Goran, why don't you set the scene for our discussion today?
Thank you, Enrique. We're really pleased to continue with a series of conversations with current and former director of think tanks in Europe. In the first episodes, we had the privilege to interview Vesela Cherneva from the European Council on Foreign Relations, Sonja Stojanovic-Gajic from the Belgrade Center for Security Policy, Petar Kreko from Political Capital Institute in Budapest, and Karolina Vigura from Kultura Liberalna in Warsaw. The insights from these guests, representing think tanks with a national focus, but also aspiring to link their country regionally and more broadly to Europe, were really, really invaluable. And we got a really good response to these interviews, encouraging us to continue with this exploration and continue documenting the lessons learned that help think tankers and also funders who are supporting think tanks. We're continuing with a new series, and as people who have listened to the previous podcast episodes, we in these interviews we discuss with the think tank leaders about the context in which they operate and the way they navigate it in difficult political circumstances. We also discuss the development of their own organizations, the key strategic decisions for them to grow or shrink or change focus, but as well the impact that this work has made on them as individuals and leaders. As always, we also conclude with their invaluable advice, which we hope will benefit the people who are currently or intend to engage as future think tankers. In this episode, we focus on the European integration of the countries in the south of Europe that struggled to enter the bloc. It is really imperative for a lot of policymakers to consider how significant is this process for everything that these countries have. And our guest is an expert on the subject and leads a specialized think tank on the accession to the European Union in one of the smallest countries in the Western Balkans.
Thank you, Goran. So after this introduction to the series, let me welcome our guest. Simonida is director of the European Policy Institute, EPI, and an expert on EU integration, as Goran has very clearly explained. Simonida was instrumental in establishing the think tank in 2011, and she has been a key figure in its operations ever since. She has been director of the Institute since 2017. Prior to this, she held a senior position in the Secretariat for European Affairs in the government of the Republic of Macedonia. Welcome, Simonida.
Well, hi. Hi, Goran. Hi, Enrique. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you, Simonida. And let me start with a question about the context. In my introduction, I already mentioned, and coming myself from the Western Balkans and from the same country that you come, I can know a lot about these intricacies. But as in this type of shows, we know the time is rather short, and describing the situation in North Macedonia and the Western Balkans will require podcast episodes on its own. So we try to make it sort of lively and short by posing a simple question. If your country or regional context was a movie, which one would it be?
I was thinking a lot about this. Depends on the day. Depends if you're actually on an optimist or a realist on that day. And I also consulted with my colleagues. So I'll do a couple of movies. If some of you probably there will be also movies recommendations. My choice was actually the book Catch-22, because in a lot of ways the work that we do oftentimes on European integration feels very much we feel very much being against a wall of bureaucracy. I mean, for the outside world, but then we realize that actually some of that bureaucracy is useful for us. So we try to untangle the Catch-22 situation. Also, having in mind that we deal with several contexts. You mentioned the word context in your introduction. For us, we deal on several planes of context: the national context, which is the very small country that you mentioned, North Macedonia, 2 million people. Then we have a bit of a regional context of 6 countries that are trying to reach the same goal, membership in the European Union. This is a very small region in total, so it's probably we don't have more than 15 million people together. And then at the top of that level, we have the European context, the 500 million people in the European Union, the European Union as an entity that we're trying to reach. And our work kind of also depends on these 3 contexts, but also on the bureaucracies on these 3 levels. So that's why I'll stick with Catch-22 and the various challenges that we face.
And Goran, what would be your film, since you're from the same country? Have you given this question of the film a thought?
Not yet, not yet. I have to say, though a lot could come into my mind. I like a lot old Polish cinema. Double Life of Veronica from Kieślowski. Kind of an old movie comes to mind, but not so much about the content, but actually about the lives of 2 people. Sometimes, so often, I feel that the region, Western Balkans, and my own country, North Macedonia, have this kind of a double life. Like, on one way, there's the reforms, European Union, and on the other side, there's the harshness of everyday life, and somehow I would say often the corruption, that not only corruption in material sense, but the corruption where people do not strive for better standards in their life. So, yeah, I'm trying to juggle with these 2. So that's why anything that has double in its title will be appealing to me. Thanks, Kike. That was a good prompt.
We will come back to you at the end of the series and ask you if you found a film or a book that best describes North Macedonia and also the region, right? As we've been talking about this. In this context, Simonida, maybe you can reflect a little bit about the role of think tanks and the different roles that they have played over the last decade or so. And I've been sort of following the work of think tanks in the Western Balkans from some time. In my professional career, a lot of my early work, especially since I founded on think tanks, was with think tanks in the region through the think tank fund where Goran worked. I was able to work with Sonja Stojanovic-Gajic, for instance, in Serbia, and many of your colleagues in the region. And it's the political landscape has certainly undergone significant changes. And therefore the role of think tanks must have also changed. Can you maybe elaborate on some of those developments that you've witnessed since your early days at EPI?
Sure. First, I would start with the disclaimer that in many of these countries and in this whole region, actually, the word think tank has been appropriated from English. So
Yeah.
I don't think that it's ever felt very much domesticated. I would start with that element of the.
So when you decided to be part of this sort of foundation of EPI, the word think tank resonate? Was that the word you guys used in your meetings?
It did because we have a very specific story. I think probably every think tank has a very specific story. Most of the founders of my organization were actually people that came in the early 2000s back to the country, supported by various scholarships throughout Europe, the European Union, and actually to come and assist the country in its European integration in various areas. Unfortunately, the Euro-optimism which accompanied the 2004 and 2007 enlargement of the European Union, what we call the Big Bang enlargement, stopped due to various reasons at the end of the first decade of this century. So practically, I think many of us ran the risk of being like the Marxism teachers in the early 1990s. We were wondering, how are we going to use our skills? You know, if this process does not continue. And it was evident that, going back to my first to where I started with the arguments on the different contexts in the European Union, this was not the most positive context for actually to discuss enlargement to the Western Balkans. At our national level, also the political landscape started deteriorating politically. So that's why we decided to establish a research organization. But going back to the difficulty of accommodating the word think tank actually in our legal system, also in our legal environment, there's several ways to find an alternative to build a think tank. One is the regular association of citizens, or NGO, which is the path that we have taken. Other colleagues have taken the path of actually establishing research institutes, separate research institutes as scientific organizations. But you would really need to find your way to kind of adapt your idea, your vision to build a think tank of a specific topic using the capacities and the skills of the people that have gathered, but having in mind that the national legal system, and that also means the policymaking system, does not really seek for external advice. So oftentimes you will have to impose yourself, and this there's a lot of other preconditions that would need to happen with it. Our advantage was that some of us had actually worked in the most of us in the Secretariat for European Affairs in our government, which was at pretty high level in the government structures because it's a vice ministerial position, which meant that we had established relationships with many of the senior people in the administration. But these would be senior civil servants who actually would speak the policy language that we do. So that was probably one of our first advantages, and being recognized by initial donors, such as probably you mentioned that I was instrumental in the establishment. Probably to some level, the person sitting against me here, Goran, was also very much instrumental. So this was our establishment in at the end of the decade, and then probably we were established in the decade of chaos. The 2010 up to these 15 years of our existence have been a decade and a half of shifts. Going back to your original question, in the region, unfortunately, since our establishment, the indicators on democracy, the indicators of openness of institutions have not really developed positively. In fact, both my own country and the region overall have experienced a period of maybe of general stagnation or backsliding. This has been accompanied also by a general trend of retrenchment on many of the democratic indicators within Europe as its main reference point. And these are far from the fertile conditions that one would like to have. But at the same time, this has been a challenge. So at the same time, you did have those people at the senior level, civil servants, who are open to push for the European agenda. And these are the people with whom we built these linkages to actually be able to influence both at the national, but at the regional level and the European level as well. We found out very early on that actually building partnerships with our specialized organizations, as Goran called them, in the region, but also in the EU, was instrumental for all of us to have an amplified effect and to try to reach the maximum of our efforts. I would not say our goals or to have a major impact, but to maximize our efforts is probably the best way to put it now.
So this early start at the beginning of that decade and a half of chaos that you've described, there is a sense of an opening, right? I mean, you're creating a think tank because there is maybe a possibility of engaging with policymakers, civil servants at that level that you had identified, right? Working at also the EU integration level discussion. That means that a think tank, is probably more about a technocratic support, it's advice, it's the kind of things you'd assume a think tank would do. Has that role changed over time? As chaos has ensued, as the government has closed, as the democratic institutions and therefore communication channels have closed, have think tanks in the country and region, have they also had to change their approach to engaging with these actors?
Just a bit of a explanation. At the beginning of the decade of chaos was probably the time when the European Union started to look inward and not to the countries of the region. So our mission was not only technocratic; it was more to keep the European idea alive and to keep the European agenda alive, coupled with the technocratic mission, because this whole process of European enlargement entails a lot of bureaucracy of legal alignment, policy alignment, and institution building. So I would say that the mission was twofold. And in many ways, we felt that we could do this better from the outside, that we could have a stronger voice on the outside by building also these partnerships. But going back to your question of the trends, at the national level, we have experienced in these 15 years the biggest political crisis and the biggest human rights violations to a wiretapping scandal by the government in mid 2015-16. And this was the period of the biggest democratic backsliding in the country itself. As I said before, probably we also experienced the biggest grassroots movement in the country of actually building grassroots support for change, which was exceptional, which is probably one of the rare moments in our lives when we will experience bottom-up pressure in the way that we did. But unfortunately, we also were at the same time at the root of the biggest refugee migration crisis in Europe. So going back to what I explained in the beginning, even though there was a lot of political pressure for change within the country, it took some time to actually materialize or to have a democratic breakthrough, because for many of the political actors in the European Union, our third level of reference, the main position was that this small country would need to be stable and maintain its governance so that it can manage the refugee migration route. So in this sense, we did experience after 2017, we had a big breakthrough, a return to the European agenda, unfortunately, which due to various circumstances, which included other bilateral disputes of the countries of North Macedonia with its neighbors, did not come to fruition. So we are back at unfortunately, we're back at in a situation in which there's a lot of questioning about the direction in which this country is headed, but also the entire region as such, not in the least because of the trends that we see at a more global Western in the Western developed democracies that we would like to reference, although we are very concerned about the labels that we use after the US elections and after many of the trends that we are seeing across Europe. So to summarize, the context in which a think tank in a small country or a small region overall operates even with its partners, in our position of being in the middle of Europe, but yet not a part of it, being the less developed part of Europe, actually is very much affected not only nationally, but also by the broader European context and also the links and the signals that are being sent from the US, which have made the work of many of the think tanks, especially recently, very difficult.
Let me ask one more question before Goran takes over, because I just want to get a very clear sense of that space. Because you've described, I mean, your center's looking at European integration, but what you've described, of course, are a number of sort of more domestic policy issues, right, that affect that European integration. So, and this is a small country, as you very clearly described. So, who else is there in the think tank scene in your country, right? In the polity space that you are engaging with? Like, who is doing the research on migration policy? Who is doing research on or providing policy advice on trade and macroeconomic policy or education or other sectors? Is it universities or think tanks? Can you give me a bit of a sense of that local scene?
Sure. It's very, sometimes I'm grateful. I'm hoping I'm not going to miss anyone in terms of the topic that people are working on. One can say that in the last 20 years, probably, I think that this is the period in which the think tank scene has been inhabited or has developed in the country. We have come to a point in which there are, going back to the specific topics that you mentioned, there are specialized organizations that would work on specifically inside migration. On the economic side, it's always been a bit more difficult because sometimes research institutes of the universities have taken over this role, but there are colleagues that work on macroeconomic topics, many times much more linked to the universities. The question of the role of universities always is probably the one that I should have touched upon even previously when we talk about think tanks, when I was mentioning the tracks that people were taking to in the establishment of the think tanks. The universities in this country, unfortunately, have not taken over that much. Probably I'm being very politically correct, have not taken sufficiently the role of research, especially in the social sciences. This is a chronically underfunded, undervalued, maybe in some ways, sidelined research work. Maybe partly even the legacy of the socialist system, which valued, not needless to say, much more the research in the natural sciences, because actually you would find much more research done, quality research at universities and faculties which deal with natural sciences. The social sciences dimension has been neglected, and together with a failure to reform over time the universities for the last 30 years since our independence, has led to a situation in which much of the research that you mentioned on these topics is actually being done outside of the universities. Because oftentimes the universities find it hard to adapt. They have a huge administrative burden. So that's why you would find actually, and there's also the issue of having the challenge of accommodating people that would return from abroad with education from Europe, the US, or whatever we want to note. So in that sense, you would find a relatively sound, established scene of several think tanks. Many operate with a small number of staff. Going back to our main discussion, many outsource a lot of the work that they do to university professors, but because these university professors can't do that research through the universities. So this kind of creates a bit of a specific informal scene of think tanks, and probably in that way, if I take a look at my colleagues who do research on the topics that you mentioned, all of us would find our own ways in operating. We have colleagues that, as I said, would work mostly with university professors. We have colleagues which are basically 2 or 3 people highly specialized on specific topics. There's research institutes that would provide also some degrees. And for example, in our own case, we are at the moment when we started, we have a bit for starting from scratch, 15 years onwards. We try to be a learning organization which keeps its staff over time. So we have, for the context of North Macedonia, we have at the moment 13 or 14 full-time employees, which is quite an administrative burden. But then we're also very much happy to see when that most of the people have been with us for more than 5 or 6 years, or even longer. And when they move on to positions in society which enable them to actually contribute to a policy level. Most of our most recent employee that left the organization was now appointed a judge. We have had members of specific committees working on human rights that left the organization. So in that sense, we have taken a bit of a different path in terms of since our founding. But I would say that in this sense, going back to your original question, there is evidently a need for that policy advice in many of the areas. The institutions are sometimes politically hesitant to take that advice at the political level, but if you go below to the level that I mentioned, the senior civil servants, you would actually find a lot of demand for policy analysis that would have the capacity to grab the nuances of the local context together with the European one, which is the primary reference point for them.
Really interesting.
Thanks, Simonida. Quite, not only interesting to me, is also kind of reliving parts of my work and my life. But I have to say, in this context, small countries often have a lot of disadvantages. But in this case, small is beautiful because actually, unlike mid-sized or big countries, the threshold to start your operation is really low. And I think that has been the case in North Macedonia, but not only there, also in many of those smaller to mid-sized countries where actually you can start a center. And as the time has shown over the past 15, 20 years, many of those centers not only continue to exist, but they've also stabilized in what for that country will be a mid-size operation, because that's not a small operation given the size of the market and given the size of the whole policy field as such, which is still under construction. And I would definitely see in that things that organizations like yours have done something really, really right. I want to go in that direction, actually. I want to move back to your organization. I mean, you've been there for, decade and a half. And my question, you mentioned some of your successes, but what are the other things that you've done well in these turbulent times? And then also on the flip coin, what you could have done differently in the same time?
Yeah, I think I touched upon it. I think the first one when I was thinking about that question, probably the first success is actually to make it for 15 years, having started with literally nothing, and to have managed to build from the beginning, that when we actually established the organization, to build a learning environment, because what we feel in many ways is that due to this specific context that I mentioned of less attraction of the European idea overall, we really felt the need to actually be able to socialize a younger generation of researchers who would be devoted to, and who would be able to contribute. So in that sense, having people stay in the organization and thrive for a very long time is probably the first success that I would consider. The other success, I'm not sure I like the success, but the other achievement I would single out is probably the link that we managed to establish with the start with many of the grassroots organizations that are monitoring the specific policies in which we work, such as judiciary, fundamental rights, public administration reform, and so on. Because we could actually use a lot of their findings and to shape them in a policy language, and to make their work more relevant in front of higher level interlocutors, be it at the national level, be it at the European level. So these partnerships with smaller organizations in terms of helping them maximize their impact have been essential to the work that we have done, for example, through some shadow reporting that we have established for more than a decade now on areas of judiciary and fundamental rights. This has led to key landmark court decisions, but also it has led to policy changes that we were able to contribute to. Probably the other big thing that kind of also was an organizational effort is that we managed from 2018 to be a national research partner of the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union for North Macedonia. And this is practically a seal of excellence, which is not the most financially significant, but it's a seal of excellence, putting us in the same level as research organizations and universities in EU member states, which provide the similar function that we have. So in this sense, I think that these would be some of the key achievements. I'm generally very wary when I talk of achievements, but I think that in terms of the research that we have done, given the resources and given the contextual circumstances, I think that we did a good job. Now, what we could have done, I think because of this overall focus on the research, a lot of times very heavy research, I think that we could have started much more earlier in building lighter communication tools. I think that in that sense, this is the challenge that probably is ahead of many of the think tanks in the world, all across Europe. Some are doing a way better job, but this is probably due to us probably under budgeting many of these and not setting enough time for a lot of this communication, and feeling also under pressure because of a lot of the permanent or perpetual fundraising that we are doing. So you're so oftentimes over-focused on the research outputs that actually you fail to communicate, use, reuse some of the work that you have done. And these are very think tank specific, these are very contextualized challenges that I'm mentioning, but I think that in this sense, this is probably, if we had to identify one of the things that we really need to work on, given the amount and the scope of research work that we deliver, this would be probably one of them. The other challenge that we have ahead of us is that we've recently started to lead big regional projects in the Western Balkans, which is an achievement on the one hand, because it's a recognition that you would be able to there's a potential for the organization to grow, but then it's also a challenge in the given political circumstances and the given divisions that exist in the region. But nevertheless, we are hopeful and we are ready to take on that battle. In a bigger sense, I think that the biggest failure is that not probably we would have wished to be at a different point of the European integration process than we are at this point of time, given when we were established, because we've not seen a change that we were hoping for, but that depends on many other factors as well.
I think that's the point you made about still being here for after so many years, especially during this period of turmoil or difficulties, is a point that is not often made by think tanks when they're trying to demonstrate their impact, right? But actually, it is hard to sustain an organization and to build an organization over time. Can you say something a little bit more about the challenges involved in that sustainability in relation to funding? So have there been any trade-offs, for instance, in accessing funding, but having to take on certain research agendas, or accessing funding, or having to pursue certain strategic directions throughout these years that, have been advantageous or maybe not so much for your organization?
Yeah, the perpetual fundraising challenge comes with the seal of the nonprofit. We are very much nonprofit, and that is probably a challenge also because you reach a certain cap of how much you can actually pay or set aside for your employees, which would be also very attractive to be headhunted by other international organizations and so on. But the other challenge with the nonprofit is also how to secure the funding as such. We had a bit of a probably some we had we didn't have such a traumatic story, but it was not easy either. From our establishment, we were supported by the USF at the time with the think tank fund. And probably the one lesson that kind of remained with us is don't rely on any donor too much, not more than 25%. So that was probably the ingrained religion that we started with, but this meant that you had to diversify, which was a challenge, and especially at times of political crisis and uncertainty, when the donors also we noticed that the donors withdrew their funds, or they just announced a hold for 1 year or 2 years or similarly, and this has a huge impact if you're aiming, such as we were, to actually keep a sound level or sound number of staff that you're investing in. Our funding, we early on shifted to the biggest funder in our world, which is actually the European Union. That funds organizations such as my own, mostly through what is called their civil society instruments. So oftentimes you would actually need to combine the tasks of research with advocacy and other, potentially to develop other skills needed so that you can actually fit their requirements. I would not say that we went to adjusting agendas, because I think that here we were very strict on what actually is that we want to research. Probably one of the I would not say compromises, but in some level, one of the skills that we had to develop in order to compete for this funding was the capacity to sub-grant. So we had to re-grant and to take a lot of administrative tasks in supporting other smaller organizations in order to be able to access that funding, because that has, from probably more than a decade now, been a requirement of bigger EU grants. But I would not say that, I mean, this has made us organizationally stronger. I mean, I would not say that it's been a downside. What has been oftentimes a challenge is the challenge of actually undervaluing the work of many of the researchers in the organizations when there were tough times. So you would have to actually try to compete for funds in which you're very much aware that you're undervaluing the effort of your own staff and my own personally. So I think that that's something that we had to adapt to. We had to take those bullets at oftentimes. And our other line in which we have diversified our work in our funding sources has actually been forms of consultancy done by the organizations, which stay as funds in the organization itself. This goes back to my first to my first point of being a nonprofit. Not every person is suited or has that attachment to an organization to be okay or to be ready to contribute a lot of their work that could breed a higher financial resource somewhere else to build an organization. But in many times we have done, for example, combination of consultancy work which would link to our research for the benefit of the organization itself, and that has created has enabled us to have a safety belt to overcome some very difficult times. In this probably maybe a very pink story, we have had an occasion after the transition of leadership when I took over as a director. We did have a period in which this was very difficult. So we did have a period in which for 1 or 2 months, we actually borrowed from our founders funds for salaries, but this was, you fix it within a year, and then you try to, better times did come, but it was not easy.
That's really interesting when you say that the huge variety of ways in which you as an organization have adapted to be able to raise the funds you need to deliver your mission. On that note, let's take a short break, and after we return, we can talk more about the personal impact of running a think tank and some ideas for the future.
We're back from the short break, and we would like to continue a bit more on the personal side of being a leader in a think tanker. Simonida, you spoke a lot about your work, your decisions, the challenges, and successes. But we would like also to hear how that has impacted you as an individual. What has been the best part of your work as a leader of a think tank, but also what has been the most difficult or challenging part of being a leader of a think tank?
I think that the best part of working at all in a think tank has been the freedom of thought and opinion. The presence in the public space gave me probably and also an opportunity to be at peace with myself, that I have a voice, and that you have a voice that you base on sound evidence, on topics that you know of. So I think that not many times in many of the professions that would probably be alternative to me, such as, for example, maybe government work, maybe international organizations, I have come to realize that most of my colleagues have lost their personal voice. And this is not easy. So I think that the personal voice is probably the best part of it, including with the experience of actually mentoring people and seeing people grow in their profession to a level that I will be actually fine to say, you're better at this than I am, so just take it over and I don't have to deal with it. So it gives me more time to have my own free thoughts. The most difficult times have been times in which you can't that on many levels. One is probably the fundraising element, which leaves you sleepless at night. With Sonia Stojanovic, guys that you have on your other podcast, we did a training once, and actually the first slide that we had was a picture of a woman that's not sleeping at night, and what keeps you awake. For me, this has been the fundraising challenges, oftentimes together with I would be amiss not to say that that I have this thought in the back of this light in the back of my mind, which switches on every time that we see a major regression in democratic standards here and also in Europe and beyond, because it makes you wonder what kind of a world are we headed in, at least for the medium term. That probably comes from the fact that I'm someone who grew up in the 90s and early 2000s under the premises of in the hopes of a much more liberal, globalized world that we were hoping to see than the ones that actually I am probably, I would not say growing up, but getting old in. So I think that in this sense, my challenge, my biggest question mark is that whether how much of an alliance will be able to build on issues such as human rights and democratic standards in 5 or 6 years. And I'm very concerned that that will be a much weaker alliance than what was the case in 2005 or 2011 when we started the think tank.
And Simonida, if you have one advice, you, Simonida, from today, to give to the Simonida in 2011 when you were starting to be a think tanker, or Simonida 2017, 18 when you were becoming director, what would be that advice?
Probably to sleep, like to be take your sleep. So don't dwell over too much over those same challenges, because if there is, I think that with the work that one is investing in, something that we were investing as a team at my organizations, there's a very much a likelihood that not only donors but stakeholders will recognize the value of it. in material and immaterial terms, so that you will find your supporter or that alliance that we are hoping for.
I think a lot of our listeners are not from the Western Balkans. They're not from Southern Europe or Eastern Europe, but I think they will recognize many of the struggles and many of the challenges that you and others that we have interviewed for this series are describing. And I just wonder about the things they should try to take away from your experience or their experience of your partners as they embark in their own their own journeys. And I wonder if you think that there are any kind of lessons that you've learned that are universally useful, that might be worth highlighting for them. But I also like you to think about any kind of advice you would want to give the funders of think tanks, because I think a lot of the challenges that we describe in these conversations are not challenges that think tanks on their own are going to be able to solve, but those that are, that hold the key to many of the things they can and cannot do, the funders need to also deliver on. What do you think might be some of those of universal lessons that could be shared?
I'll start with the second aspect because it's easier for me, because I feel more competent to be giving lessons to the funders than to the other people. But let's see. On the funders, the funding for a strange-looking organization as a think tank is oftentimes not considered a priority to start with. But then in many of these contexts, such as you mentioned, in less developed policy contexts, but I'm even wondering now, I mean, whether we need to go more broadly, the need for policy advice is huge. I mean, it's very big. It's there. This is a result of many contextual circumstances. I mean, in the least because of less developed policy making systems, or policy making systems that have existed for a shorter time. Many of these countries in the context that I'm working with have been independent countries for 35 years now. So it's not, I mean, I oftentimes joke when I work on when I mention these numbers, is that in historical terms this will be nothing. I mean, it will be our life, but in historical terms this is a very short period. Many much more developed states and administrations have really in the West have developed over much longer periods of time. So it's also a question of how much do we expect. So in that sense, the need for the advice is there. Yet the think tankers' work is never on the list of priorities. Oftentimes, going back to some of the questions that we had before, the think tankers' work has to be kind of hidden or wrapped as a work of a civil society organization. The regranting aspect that I mentioned that has been very much attached to many of the European Union funding. The modalities of big donors, which oftentimes in the region that we are encountering would prefer to give a lot of the policy research funds to international organizations that operate in the region, that would afterwards outsource their work to think tanks, which means that a lot of the majority of the funds would stay with the international organizations, which is in one way or another operating in the region, and does not reach and a small proportion of those funds go to the research organizations, which is actually performing the work on the ground. So you create this level of bureaucracy, and you strip down the funds as you go. These are some non-conventional advice in addition to the standard one. First is that you can't expect a think tank to be built over a year with a project of 6 months or a year. I mean, this is some of the basic lessons that we have learned. It takes some time. And it also takes an effort of actually supporting experimentation. A lot of the work that sometimes will be done in think tanks might at the end turn out to be a sort of a failure in policy, but then a lot of lessons will be drawn from it. And at the same time, no one is actually ready to fund think tanks that would be experimenting with a lot of policy, with options and so on and so forth. So in this sense, I think that the advice to the funders is to probably take a look and consider the work that think tanks are doing to start with, because there is a sense that and to potentially think of ways in which this work can be recognized. It's even from the way that we are talking about, it's even like informal labor, because you have to shield it in some way or another to match the civil society definition or to match the work that some international organization is doing. When I talk, I mean, the thought that I have at the back of my mind is when I'm discussing this is actually against which context we're discussing the issue of funders. We would be amiss if we don't mention that the primary risk that many of us face is the withdrawal in the short term of many of the key funders at all for be it civil society work, let alone think tank work in Europe. Starting from the trends that we saw from the US, but we've already had the announcement that some of the key development work at all, development assistance from the UK, from the Netherlands, and not to mention many more, will be cut. So in that sense, I feel that when I would be talking about improving the funding for think tanks, I'm really going miles beyond the challenges that we are now facing, because I think that many of us will be facing, and many of my colleagues already are facing, that we're working with the USA funds, existential threats. As to the lessons for other regions, probably these are very conventional, in the type of what my grandparents would have said to try to say things in simple words. I think that persistence and maintaining to one's mission is a very fancy word, but to the competences that you have and to the area which you have delineated as your own is key. This will sometimes be a challenge, but if I take a look at over these 20 years, the think tanks that you mentioned in my country, in the region, the ones that have made it or that are still there, I would not say that they succeeded, but that are still there, because that's our indicator of success that we used, were the ones that did not try to adapt so much to the donors' requirement, to the donors' agendas. They were the ones that managed to occupy a niche, as difficult as it was. Maybe at times they were able, for sure, at times they were less able to fundraise than organizations that were overstretching or trying to adapt to some of the trends. But those are the ones that actually made it. And I think that when we talk among colleagues, amongst ourselves, I think that bottom line for many of us, including myself, I don't see an alternative work an alternative field in which I would be probably so successful as the one that I am, and also so satisfied with myself.
Simonida, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much. Those are excellent recommendations to funders and to other think tanks around the world. Goran?
You shared a lot of your work, Simonida, and great insights. It's very hard to summarize them, but let's give it a try. And you talked about your think tank and the journey that it did. If there was a song, which song would your think tank be?
This one I give credits to my colleague Beba. She's when we were competing in my organization through a participatory approach, which should be the song. I think that Bohemian Rhapsody was the one that kind of came out. Because amongst our 14 members of staff, we have lawyers, we have economists, we have political scientists, and so on, that work sometimes on very different topics, but the whole entity or the whole story kind of is one that is very much synchronized and would make sense. So that would be the song.
Fantastic. I think we had the copyright options. We could put all those the songs and the films in the background as well. But we'll see what we can do. We'll do I think we'll do a film review article and a song review article at the end of the series of interviews. Simonida, thank you. This has been great. It's been fantastic. I really enjoyed this conversation. You can listen to this and other interviews of the series on think tanks in a changing Europe on our OTT podcast whenever you get your podcast, or visiting the OTT website at onthinktanks.org. From Goran and me, thank you and goodbye.